longest and loudest disputes of the modern world, a conflict that outlived revolutions, toppled empires, drained superpowers, and split the planet in two. For more than a century, capitalism and socialism weren't just economic ideas. They were opposing battle lines, trenches carved deep into global history. Behind every patriotic speech, every worker uprising, every economic downturn, and every proxy war fought in someone else's backyard. This rivalry shaped the world we live in. But here's the truth. Almost no ideological commentator ever acknowledges. Neither system ever worked the way it was promised. Not once. Not anywhere. And whenever real pressure hit, war, famine, inflation, collapse, the facade shattered and the reality showed itself with brutal clarity. For more than 100 years, capitalism and socialism weren't dusty concepts locked in textbooks. They were living forces, two rival blueprints competing to shape humanity's future. When leaders delivered fiery speeches, these ideas were in the background. When workers filled the streets, these ideologies pushed from beneath the surface. Every recession, every political crisis, every clash fought through someone else's territory. All of it carried the fingerprints of this ideological war. And through all those upheavals, one uncomfortable reality became impossible to ignore. The world we inherited wasn't shaped by theory, but by the collision of these two systems. Yet, there's a point almost no one ever admits, a truth that gets left out of the manifestos, speeches, and political sermons. Neither model functioned the way its architects imagined, not in practice, not under pressure, not once in the real world. And whenever the world tightened its grip, through war, through famine, through spiraling prices, or total economic breakdown, the truth broke through the illusions. Grand theories dissolved, textbook promises evaporated, and what remained was the raw, unforgiving reality of human systems under stress. This is where our story begins, a story about money, power, and the forces that shape the modern world. Forces far more complicated than any ideology wants to admit. Long before the words capitalism or socialism ever existed, the world operated on something far more primitive. There was no market system, no grand economic vision, just survival, plain and brutal. Kings claimed divine authority, landlords controlled nearly everything worth owning, and ordinary people scraped by, producing just enough to avoid starvation. Progress was glacial. Life was a zero-sum struggle. If one person rose, another was pushed down. Wealth came from land, labor, and conquest. Productivity barely budged for thousands of years. And the idea that common people might become wealthy through trade or innovation. To the old world, that was madness. Then came the Industrial Revolution, a force so explosive it shattered the old world overnight. Late 17th century Britain became a pressure chamber of coal, iron, capital, and relentless ambition. Machines replaced muscle, factories replaced workshops, and a new kind of power rose, the power of private capital. For the first time in history, ordinary individuals could invest, take risks, and build wealth on a scale once reserved only for kings and empires. Productivity skyrocketed. Some people earned higher wages. Others were crushed under the weight of the new system. Inequality surged faster than any society had ever witnessed. Cities drowned in pollution. Children worked in brutal conditions. Disease spread through overcrowded slums. And yet, despite all the misery, one reality was impossible to deny. Capitalism generated more wealth, more goods, and more speed than the world had ever seen. This was the turning point, the moment socialism emerged, not as a dream, but as a reaction, a desperate response to the brutal machinery of early industrial capitalism. By the mid-1800s, thinkers like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels looked at the smokestacks, the endless factory shifts, the riots and the misery, and they reached a radical conclusion. The system itself was the problem. To them, capitalist wealth wasn't earned. It was extracted. Profit was simply the polished name for stolen labor. Opportunity was exploitation wearing a mask. They imagined a world where workers owned the factories they powered, where profits were shared, where production served human needs instead of private gain. A society without exploitation, without boom and bust cycles, without the chaos of markets, just planning, order, and dignity, to millions trapped under the grinding gears of the new capitalist era. It didn't just sound appealing. It sounded like justice. But theory is one thing. The real world is something else entirely. The world's first true experiment with socialism didn't unfold in a lecture hall or a political salon. It rose from the ruins of a fallen empire. After the Russian Revolution of 1917, Lenin inherited a nation on the brink, starving, exhausted, and decades behind the industrial powers. The Tsar was gone. The old elite had fled or been executed, and suddenly a vast, broken land needed a new operating system. So the Soviets built one from scratch. Land, factories, banks, and natural resources were seized by the state. Private business was abolished. Prices were set by bureaucrats. Production targets replaced profit motives. On paper, it promised perfect equality and efficient planning. In practice, it created something else: confusion, stagnation, and chaos. Without market prices, planners had no way to know what people wanted or how much to produce. Without competition, innovation died, and without personal reward, workers had little reason to push beyond the minimum. Shortages became a normal part of life. Lines turned into culture, and agriculture, the backbone of the old Russian economy, collapsed into famine. Eventually, Lenin was forced to backtrack, reintroducing limited private trade just to keep the nation alive. And yet, something unexpected happened. Despite the shortages, despite the chaos, despite the famine, socialism still pulled millions toward its promise, because capitalism wasn't looking much better. Not in the early 20th century. Yes, it had produced enormous growth, but it also had unleashed wild instability. Speculation spiraled out of control. Monopolies dominated entire industries. The wealthy lived like modern aristocrats, while millions scraped by. The system excelled at creating wealth, but failed miserably at distributing it. And that imbalance detonated in 1929 when the US stock market collapsed and capitalism suffered its greatest humiliation, the Great Depression. It wasn't just a downturn, it was a global economic cardiac arrest. Banks vanished, unemployment hit 25%. Countries watched their financial systems evaporate. To millions of observers, capitalism looked not just flawed, but fundamentally broken. By the 1930s, the world was forced to confront an unsettling reality. Neither system delivered what it promised. Socialism vowed equality, but produced scarcity and suffering. Capitalism pledged prosperity, but triggered collapse on a global scale. Theories that looked clean and elegant on paper fell apart the moment they collided with real human behavior and real economic pressure. And just when the world thought it had seen the worst, a new crisis erupted, one that would push every system to its absolute limit. And then came a turning point that rewrote the entire world order. World War II. The war didn't just test armies, It tested economic systems under maximum pressure. It forced every nation to reveal what its model could actually do when survival was on the line. The Soviet Union, despite its inefficiencies, mobilized with terrifying speed. Central control allowed it to redirect every resource toward one goal: endure or collapse. Meanwhile, capitalist nations like the United States transformed into industrial powerhouses, private innovation fused with national coordination, creating a wartime economic machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. When the fighting stopped, the scoreboard wasn't ideological anymore. It was measured in output, infrastructure, living standards, and growth. From 1945 to 1991, the world turned into a global laboratory, a decades-long experiment comparing two competing visions of how society should function. On one side stood the Soviet bloc: central planning, state ownership, and rigid control over markets. On the other side were the United States and its allies: regulated capitalism, private enterprise, and safety nets born from the scars of the Great Depression. This wasn't theory anymore. This was millions of people living inside two different systems, every day producing real-world evidence of what worked and what didn't. The results would be dramatic and painful. In the Soviet Union, the early decades produced explosive industrial growth. Illiteracy plummeted, urban housing expanded, military power surged, but beneath the impressive numbers, the system was cracking. Without real price signals, the economy drifted into absurd inefficiency. Factories hit quotas by producing useless or poor-quality goods. Farms delivered harvests that rotted long before they reached the people. Innovation stalled. By the 1970s, the Soviet Union was decades behind the West in consumer technology. A nation capable of launching rockets into space struggled to manufacture a reliable refrigerator. Meanwhile, capitalism adapted. It built guardrails, regulation, deposit insurance, antitrust laws, social safety nets, healthcare systems, unemployment benefits. Capitalism didn't fix its flaws, but it learned from them. And that ability to evolve became its greatest advantage. By the 1980s, the difference between the two systems was impossible to ignore. Western living standards were rising rapidly while the Soviet economy was sputtering and slowing. The Cold War wasn't won by speeches or ideology. It was won by performance, by which model could deliver a better life for its people. When the Berlin Wall finally fell in 1989, it wasn't bombs or foreign armies that defeated the Soviet Union. It was empty shelves, broken incentives, and a rigid system that could no longer keep up with a changing world. A system built to eliminate inequality ended up creating a new elite of party officials and bureaucrats, while ordinary citizens waited in endless lines for basic goods. A system designed to avoid the chaos of markets collapsed under the weight of its own inflexibility. And when the data finally arrived, it painted a blunt, unavoidable picture. The Western economies were more productive, more innovative, and far more adaptable. But capitalism's celebration didn't last. At the moment the Cold War ended, new contradictions began to surface. Fault lines no victory speech could hide. By the 1990s and early 2000s, capitalism transformed into something no economist from the 19th century could have predicted. Finance ballooned into a force of its own. Global supply chains stretched across continents. Credit flowed freely, fueling new bubbles and new dependencies. Inequality surged once again, climbing to heights reminiscent of the Gilded Age. Corporations grew into transnational giants, and entire nations became increasingly reliant on debt, speculation, and asset inflation. Then came 2008. a violent reminder that capitalism's instability had never truly disappeared. It had merely changed shape. Banks collapsed, housing markets imploded, governments rushed to prevent a complete financial meltdown. The crisis exposed an old truth in a new form. Capitalism could reinvent itself, but reinvention didn't guarantee stability. Meanwhile, socialism began to return, but not in the harsh, centralized form that defined the Soviet era. It resurfaced as something softer, quieter, and far more politically acceptable. Calls for universal healthcare, free education, stronger unions, wealth taxes, and greater economic leveling gained momentum across democracies. Younger generations, crushed by soaring housing costs, student debt, and stagnant wages, started questioning whether capitalism still worked for anyone other than the wealthy and well-connected. The old debate was reborn. But this time, almost no one wanted pure socialism or pure capitalism. History had made the trade-offs too obvious, too painful, too undeniable. Look at modern Scandinavia, and they're so often misrepresented as socialist by people who've never studied its system. These countries don't reject markets, they embrace them. They have thriving private sectors, global corporations, competitive industries, but they also built something capitalism struggled with: strong social protections, high taxes that fund public services, and unions powerful enough to negotiate real standards of living. It isn't socialism, and it isn't laissez-faire capitalism. It's a hybrid, a mixed model engineered to soften inequality while keeping innovation alive. Now compare that to the United States, a capitalist powerhouse overflowing with invention, financial depth, and global influence, yet burdened with staggering inequality, crumbling infrastructure, unaffordable healthcare, and a shrinking middle class. Two wealthy regions, two very different outcomes, two different ways of managing the same human instincts. And then there's China, arguably the most fascinating case in the modern world. Beijing calls its model socialism with Chinese characteristics, but what it truly resembles is a form of state-directed capitalism. Private companies drive most of the growth. Entrepreneurs innovate, compete, build, and push the country forward at blistering speed. Yet the government keeps its hand firmly on the wheel, controlling strategic sectors, guiding investment, and allowing markets to operate only when they align with national goals. It's capitalism in structure, socialism in oversight, and something uniquely Chinese in execution. But even China faces the same contradictions that haunt every system: debt-fueled expansion, real estate bubbles, an aging population, and slowing productivity. Its rise is remarkable. Its challenges are immense. Its model is neither a triumph of socialism nor capitalism, but a complex hybrid built through decades of trial and error. When you zoom out, the truth becomes almost embarrassingly simple. Every major economy on Earth is a hybrid, a blend of markets and state power, of incentives and protections, of freedom and control. Not because ideologies failed, but because reality forced compromise. Whenever these systems collided with actual human behavior, ambition, greed, fear, laziness, creativity, neither model held up exactly as its theorists imagined. Under pure capitalism, greed fuels innovation until it becomes exploitation. Under pure socialism, equality promotes unity until it turns into repression. In market economies, power concentrates through wealth. In command economies, power concentrates through politics. Different systems, different tools, same human tendencies, same human flaws. The real question was never which system is better, That's the distraction. The surface-level fight. The real question is far more uncomfortable. Which system has the best mechanisms to restrain power, correct its own mistakes, and reward behavior that actually benefits society? History's answer is brutally clear. The system that adapts is the system that survives. Capitalism endured because it reinvented itself from laissez-faire chaos to the New Deal era, to globalized finance, to the age of tech giants. Meanwhile, socialism collapsed wherever it refused to change. The Soviet Union, Maoist China, North Korea. And it thrived only where it merged with markets. In Scandinavia, in post-1978 China, and in parts of modern Europe. Ideology didn't decide the winners. Adaptation did. History never picked capitalism or socialism as its champion. It chose whatever prevented collapse in the moment, whatever kept societies from falling apart. Every generation has had to renegotiate that balance, redesign the guardrails, and rethink who holds the levers of power. Because this debate was never truly about systems. It was always about control. Who commands capital? Who directs the state? Who shapes the markets? Who writes the rules? Power never disappears. It simply shifts hands, from kings to landlords, from industrialists to bureaucrats, from corporations to political parties. Different eras, same struggle. If this opened a new way of thinking for you, don't forget to subscribe. History holds the answers, and I'll show you where to find them.